Oh, good evening, good morning for me over here. Good evening for y'all over there. My name is Devin. I am an alcoholic, and yeah, I'm really happy that we're back. For those of you that were here last week, thanks for showing up again, and for those of you that are just finding out about this, I'm really happy you guys are here. I'll give as we mentioned, I'll just give a brief introduction about myself, and then also like what we're hoping to do here over the next chunk of weeks. As I said, my name is Devin. I am an alcoholic. I do have a home group, which is called No Serenity Till Brooklyn in Brooklyn, New York. I happen to have a sobriety date, which is August 28th of 2011. And most importantly, I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And and what we were gonna look at discussing over the next chunk of weeks here, we don't really know exactly how long this is going to go. The idea was more to just get together and kind of mimic what I've done with my sponsor, my current sponsor, and with some other people in the past, um, which is to sit down and to look at these 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous and try to take an opportunity to just learn the history of where they come from, how does this apply in my AA group, but also to then take a look at, if these principles are all about how as a group we relate to each other and how we stay in relations and foster unity with each other. um is it possible that these principles that are underpinning the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous can also be carried outward into the real world, into our homes, into our careers, into our communities? And that's been my experiences when I really sat with some people and started to talk about these principles. I started to find out that there was a lot more consideration for myself, moving through the world. That it just gave me a lot more to consider as far as how I want to approach living and trying to relate with people. So I found that to be super useful. Um, and then, I'll give a little bit of a history of, I am sober a little over 14 years now, which in some circles could be considered long-term sobriety. But the people that I run with and some of my friends, I'm pretty junior member here. My sponsor just hit 40 years. And I've got some other friends in the 40 and 50 year range that are people I speak to regularly that have a lot more experience in service below the group level, as well as just in Alcoholics Anonymous and sponsoring people. So, um, but in the time that I've been sober, I have done a few things in AA that I think have been useful and informative with understanding the traditions, and then how our service structure in Alcoholics Anonymous over here works. And mainly, I started out as a group service representative, which we call a GSR, and I started going to area assemblies, and I joined. I got invited after being a GSR to be uh, the archives chair for basically my district, or a super district. In New York, we have the counties, which is like for Brooklyn County. I was the archives chair. I then ended up doing some service at our local central office, which is called New York Intergroup, where I was the Brooklyn area representative. And then I became, after kind of contentious resignation, I became the secretary and a board member of the local central office, serving on the steering committee. And that was right in the height of the 2020 lockdown stuff. So there was a lot going on there. And then I've been back in the general service, um, like area service over here, and I was the standing committee chair for all of southeastern New York and Area 49 for the cooperation with corrections and treatment facilities, and or cooperation with professionals rather. So the CPC is what we call it. And so I help facilitate sitting down with doctors and going to some clergy and getting a chance to, let people know what Alcoholics Anonymous is and the resources that are available to them, and hopefully be able to arm them with some connections and understanding of where we are, or what's available to them if they run into some alcoholics. And currently, I'm back trying to serve as the alternate chair for Brooklyn County. Um, and in my home group, I've done everything that you could possibly do, from being the overall chair to, right now I pass a microphone, and, so I'm a big fan of service. And I think it's really important. And I think, when I've gotten into serving on committees, what I mainly try to do is sit and listen and I try to listen to what people are saying and really consider what they're saying. And then I try to use the understanding of these 12 traditions as the guiding force of if we're starting to maybe deviate from what Alcoholics Anonymous's intended purpose is. And that's really how I try to participate in any of those committees is I want to listen first. And then if I think we're kind of going sideways, I'm going to try to bring forward, you know, one of these principles or something that we might be sidestepping. And so I offer that because I think it's, it is useful. If you guys don't know me, why would you listen to anything I have to say? And I might ask that question anyways. But I'm really happy that we're here and we're getting to talk about this because this is stuff that means a lot to me and has really been useful to me. So I'm going to do a quick recap then of what we got to yesterday or last week, which is effectively we just started looking over tradition one and this idea that the common welfare, meaning everybody together, what's best for all of us has to trump and is more important than what I think is best for me. And the way that we kind of came to these 12 traditions, I don't know if I really talked about the history of it as much. So I wanted to talk quickly about a little bit of history. The steps were born out of the initial experience that Bill Wilson had in conjunction with this group called the Oxford Group. And the Oxford Group was a Lutheran minister started an organization of people that were already deeply religious and um, wanted to, really live by spiritual principles. And it was kind of like going back to pre-institution. They would call it like first century Christianity or whatever. And so a lot of those practices of confession, of service, of mending and offering restitution for harms done, became the foundation of what we see as our 12 steps. And as AA started to take hold and we started to have groups form, Bill had a little office in New York City and he would try to send out correspondence to these different groups that were starting to form in other towns. There were people that were traveling salesmen and they would end up in Roanoke, Virginia, and they would get a guy in the hospital in Roanoke and he would get sober and they would start a little group, or somewhere down south in Florida, some guy moved from New York down to Florida finally after retiring and he started a little group. So we had these pockets of 2 and 3 or small groups of AAs getting together and forming groups. And in the mid 40s, what became apparent was a lot of these groups were not lasting. And what was happening was Bill had a secretary named Ruth Hawk, and Ruth would be sending out correspondence to let groups know what was going on in AA. And they started getting a bunch of return letters from the landlords, like from the churches or the community centers where they were meeting. And the letters said something to the effect of, this group no longer meets here. Please stop sending us mail. And so that's ultimately what the experience that started Bill to think about how do we need to figure out how to relate to each other. And so it was one of the first times I really got introduced to all this stuff. It was laid out like this. We don't have rules, we have traditions. But behind every one of these traditions are alcoholics who didn't make it. And this can sound kind of grim, but it's like, to me, there's an understanding here that like these traditions came about due to our own failing, due to Alcoholics Anonymous not being unified, due to the infighting that would happen amongst groups or the extreme requirements for membership for people to join that group that ultimately caused the groups to fall apart. And so behind every one of these is some alcoholics that got a little bit of time sober, and then ultimately drank themselves to death. And so when I think of it in that light, it's given me a little more pause to consider the gravity of and maybe the importance of what we're doing. And so I don't think there's any, I don't want to dive. There's a lot of history, and I've found the history of how AA functions to be fascinating. And there's a lot of books, and if anyone's interested in some of the books, there's books that AA's prints called AA Comes of Age, or Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers Pass It On. Those are some of the early history books that AA prints. But then there's a lot of AA members and historians that have gone on and written books about AA that are also really great. And I'm happy to send some suggestions. I also have some recordings of some people that have written those books or, are involved in the history that are talking about all this stuff. So if you're interested in that, I can also put some links forward in our group chat about that thing. But what we talked about last week, and I think what I said and what I believe is really true is the first tradition is one of those where there's less to talk about, sometimes isolated. But as we start looking at all the other 11 traditions, what we're going to find is each one of those traditions is about how it relates to impacting the unity of our group. That the most cherished quality that we have in Alcoholics Anonymous is our unity. And so the first tradition just says our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery, my recovery, depends upon AA unity. And the question that I asked last week that I would throw out again for us to consider is, how did each of us get sober? Or how did each of us stay sober? Because some of us come through the treatment door. But at some point in our journey to becoming members of Alcoholics Anonymous, we were able to go to a fully functioning group of Alcoholics Anonymous. There was already people that were sober, that were putting coffee on, that were opening the door, that had relationships with the landlord, that had bought literature. You know, there was already a fully functioning Alcoholics Anonymous in my area. That when I was dying and suicidal and couldn't stop drinking myself into a blackout, I was able to show up and meet a bunch of strangers that had alcoholism and had an answer of how to recover from that. And that's because AA existed. And so this first tradition is all about making sure that we understand that above any of us, the most important thing is that we make sure that Alcoholics Anonymous continues forward. And I remember hearing some delegates and past trustees having a conversation, and they were sharing. And one of the things they started talking about, or how they would end their shares, was the gratitude they had for Alcoholics Anonymous, but also the responsibility that they felt. They said, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, when I'm good and dead, I'd like to hope that my small contribution of service to Alcoholics Anonymous will mean that your children or your grandchildren or your grandchildren's grandchildren will have the same opportunity to get sober that I got. And they started I hadn't ever thought about that kind of a timeline, that like maybe my job here within AA is to help make sure that the message of Alcoholics Anonymous in the meetings are still here for your kids, for your grandkids, for the generations of alcoholics that are inevitably going to be born. And so when I start thinking about unity in that sense, it's the whole thing is about, I have to give up some of my personal aspiration and my pride and my righteousness and my arrogance of what I think is best, if it seems to maybe not be best for everybody. And that's tough because I'm a very arrogant and prideful person. And I think I'm right all the time. And I can rationalize why I'm right and you're wrong. Pretty easy. And so there is a long form, and I'll just read the long form of the first tradition before we jump into the second one, which says, each member of Alcoholics Anonymous is but a small part of a great whole. AA must continue to live, or most of us will surely die. Hence, our common welfare comes first, but individual welfare follows closely after. So it's never saying it's not about us. It's just saying more important than my ambitions and desires is making sure the group survives. And a good example of that for me is, I have a home group that is somewhat large. It's not the biggest meeting, but we get about 100 people on a Sunday morning. And I sit there and I'm one person. And I've gotten to watch people come in and meet somebody in that group, get sponsored. I mean, there's a lady now that is bringing her child, her newborn child, to the meeting. And I watched her count days and was there on like day 2. And now she's 9 years, 9 years sober. And she's been in our group for 8 or 9 years. I had nothing to do with sponsorship or step work or anything on her journey. But she was able to come to the home group, and she was able to meet somebody, and she was able to find that beautiful thing that happens here. And she was able to find a relationship with a God of her understanding. And I've gotten to watch her life blossom and her change into this woman that she is today. And I've seen that with countless people. And so to me, that's more important than me, right? That's, if I have a small disagreement, that's a small price to pay. Maybe I need to let go of some of that stuff if it's better for everybody. And I'll just read this one thing. So the book, The 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions, I have one of the little tiny ones. They have bigger ones, but that's if I'm going to be reading, it's going to be reading from the chapters in here that are on the traditions. And this is just one thing I'll read from tradition one, and then we'll jump to two. Um, they talk about how we could have basically anarchy. There's no leaders in AA. There's no like CEO. There's no, somebody who says this is what happens. Now, sometimes larger groups take that on. The founder of the group becomes the final say in it, and people kind of idolize that one person. But if you really get into AA, it's like we're all members, we're all equal. We do this together. So there is no one person that is the answer. The answer that we have is a loving God. But so they go, how is it possible that we could function without a leader? Everybody needs a leader. Every successful business venture, there's got to be one person that's running the thing, right? Well, and they say those who look closely soon have the key to this strange paradox. The AA member has to conform to the principles of recovery, which would be our 12 steps, that our lives actually depend upon obedience to spiritual principles. If we were to deviate too far, the penalty is sure and swift. We sicken and die. At first, we go along because we must, but later, we discover a way of life that we really want to live. And moreover, we find that we cannot keep this priceless gift until we give it away. Neither he nor anybody else can survive unless he carries the AA message. And then they talk about how the moment that this 12-step work forms a group, another discovery is made that most individuals cannot recover unless there is a group. And it says that realization dawns on me that I am but a small part of a great whole, that no personal sacrifice is too great for preservation of the fellowship, and that I have to learn that the clamors of desires and ambitions within me must be silenced whenever they could damage the group. So my experience with all these traditions is what I'm being asked to do each time is to give something up. And Bill Wilson talked about that. There was an interview or he was given a talk somewhere, and he just said, in the writing of these 12 traditions, what he found was underneath each one of them was some kind of personal desire or ambition or something within himself that he could see it was a defect that had to be let go of. And so this is just another great opportunity of things that we can look at to hopefully let go of some more of our selfishness so that we can maybe become more useful. And so we're going to keep going back to unity. Just like if I don't really believe I'm powerless over alcohol, I'm probably not really going to turn my will and my life over to God. I'm probably not going to write a thorough inventory. I'm probably definitely not making those amends, right? But if I really have a first step experience and I see the necessity of me finding power and I must get rid of this selfishness and I have to learn something of humility, that's going to be the fuel that's going to walk us through that 12-step process because I'm really going to see how screwed I am. And so the 12 traditions operate in the same very similar way. Underneath each one of these, we're gonna start looking at, well, how does this impact the unity of a group, and how might this fracture the Alcoholics Anonymous community that I'm a part of? And it's going to ask for us to give things up. So is there any questions about any of that stuff? I took a little longer maybe than expected, but I wanted to cover more or less what we got last week before I jump into the second tradition. Is there anybody that has a question or anything on that before we move forward? And maybe we won't take like a full Q&A. We'll take a couple minutes here. Go ahead, Kron.
Yeah, so two things, Devin. Like one, I come from a fellowship where business meetings are held very rarely, and even if they are held, they are just like a 5 minute thing. We just do it, we just rush it up. Um, and I just wanted to know, we have a lot of meetings, we have a lot of groups which operate as meeting places more than doing service as a group together. And I just wanted to know what can we do there uh, to do better service and your experience with the second tradition through the years, these two things. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question, and that's something I think we see here. I felt like we have a lot of meetings and very few groups. And what I mean by that is there's plenty of places where people get together and talk about AA, and you read a script and it looks like it's an AA meeting, and it is, but there isn't really a group like a general service representative and intergroup delegate, and maybe there aren't like people that have really said, I'm going to be a member of this group and make it, put a flag here and be here for like longer period of time. Might be a very transient group of people that whoever is there figures it out. For a couple of months that guy's kind of running it, and then they move on. Um, but and maybe what I'll do is I'll be able to hopefully answer a good chunk of that as we start to move into this discussion. But ultimately, the beginning of any group having any kind of change is going to be we got to get together and have a group conscience. We got to get together with the actual people that are there, and if they say this is my group, it's like, well, if this is your home group, let's get together and let's have a group conscience. Um, every group. So what we'll learn when we start looking at the fourth tradition, and I'll just briefly touch on it. And I will say, forgive me if I jump around a little bit, because from where I sit today, this is all kind of like you guys make some incredible food, and the food that gets made in your culture involves usually a lot of spices. But like you don't want to just eat paprika by itself. You want to throw that into the pot, and then the way that interacts with everything else is what makes the beautiful dish that you're going to eat afterwards. And I think for me, when I start to look at these traditions, it's very much like these are all ingredients that have been thrown into this pot, and they kind of mix together. And so we're going to get to talk about how each group has one authority, which is a loving God, is expressed in the group conscience. And then the other side of that is every group is autonomous, meaning every group gets to decide how it wants to function. And you guys might make a different choice than maybe my group about how we want to function or the format of a meeting or what we want to do. And there's nobody from AA that could come in and tell you guys you're doing something wrong, unless you're kind of bringing in a bunch of there are certain things, like if all of a sudden you guys started reading one specific spiritual text and it became less about a God of your understanding and more about Jesus Christ, for instance, like that could maybe be starting to skirt like, yeah, it sounds like you're taking a position on religious, sectarian religion, and we got to be careful because AA doesn't get involved in that. Or you become more of a politically driven thing. So we're here and we're talking, we're the, in my country, it could be the Republicans of Alcoholics Anonymous or the Democrats. That would be like, hey, we got to tone that down, right? So there are certain things that would maybe warrant a letter from the general service office or from the area saying, hey, we've become aware that you guys are doing this stuff, and we feel like this is really a bad, this is against our traditions, and here's why. But nobody could come in and like shut you down. The worst thing that could ever happen is, over here at least, is they might delist you from any of the registries of meetings. Like in our central office has like a website with, find a meeting. And if your group was kind of going rogue on a bunch of that stuff, they would just say like, all right, we're probably going to delist you, so that if someone is looking for AA meetings in New York City, we're going to take that meeting off, because it seems like they're going totally sideways. But they couldn't come in and shut you down. There's no way to do that. But so I think that the question that you were asking is, it would start here in the second tradition. And so I'll read the short form and the long form, and I will share. There's two things about the short and the long form here that I find really amazing. So the short form of tradition 2 says, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. And then let me read the long form, and let's see if we can find one of the things that I think is amazing. The long form of tradition 2 is, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. So if you caught it, the short form is longer than the long form. The long form does not contain, our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. That seemed to be added, and either they misprinted the short form on as the long form and the long form on as the short form, But if you look at like the 12 traditions on a shade, the way we would print them out and hang them in a meeting, it's actually longer than what they say is the long form of the tradition, which I think is just really alcoholic and wonderful. Um, that's like the kind of people we're dealing with. You know, we have a long form that's shorter than the short form. It's fantastic. But it also is very much the exact same, you know, and so I think that says something that like there was no real reason to write anymore because of how to the point this is. And so what is this saying? It says, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority. And I think that's an interesting way to put it. There's an ultimate authority here. The ultimate authority is not the group chair. It's not the longest like member, like longest standing member of the group. But the ultimate authority within Alcoholics Anonymous and a group of alcoholics is a loving God as expressed through our group conscience. And to me, that's really it. I mean, that is at the end of the day, if you were to say, what is the solution to alcoholism? The only answer that we seem to have is conscious contact with the God of our understanding. And then the only real authority we seem to have here in these traditions is remember that God thing that was the most important part of our lives? That is the authority in the group. I will point this out, and I just find it really interesting that in all the AA literature that I've looked at, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that this tradition is the only time that we get an adjective describing God. All over the big book in Chapter to the Agnostic, you know, we talk about it's a God of your understanding, and we give all these different ways to describe it. But in this tradition, what we get told is that the authority we have in AA is a loving God. And I just find that really interesting. And that for me is something I can really get down with. You know, and this is my own personal thing, but I can't really get down with a God that is punishing. That doesn't make sense to me. But the idea that what is brought forward here is that like there's a loving God and there's a loving power out there that's the answer, that I can do business with that. So I think that's really interesting just to see that there is a little adjective, and it's the only place I've ever found an adjective in AA literature around God. Um, and so we're going to talk about the two types of leaders. And I want to talk about an informed versus an uninformed group conscience. And I want to speak a little bit about the simple majority versus substantial unanimity. We have a quick question. Go ahead, Karthik.
So, I just want to step back to tradition one if that is okay. Um, so yeah, unity in the sense, see, if, you know, just because, we have to open a group, people keep opening the groups, okay, in new areas. It's like, yeah, because we don't have so many people in our fellowship, okay. So what I feel is, when we split up so much, the unity gets impacted, especially the tradition five. I know we are not a tradition five, but there aren't many people, as coming back to Karan's question, we don't even have people to conduct business meetings, really. You know, uh, one person does like multiple roles in the group. So what do you think? Do you think a group has to get stronger before opening new groups, or how does that impact unity? Maybe this is a tradition five question, but I just wanted to put it there. Is it better to build a strength of the group before we move to it's just 10 miles away, or 5 miles away? Let's say it's 5 miles away, you're starting a new group. So what are your thoughts on that? I know it's not like a bookish question or something like that, but maybe you can go to your higher power and answer that. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess the way I think about it is less primary purpose, but this is really what starts to come out in the long form of the fourth tradition, where they say, hey, every group is autonomous except when our matters are affecting AA or other groups as a whole. And one of the things that is mentioned in the long form of the fourth tradition is this idea that we should be good neighbors. And so My home group has 4 meetings a week. That's something that maybe people haven't, some groups might add more meetings than just having one meeting a week. And I found that to be useful, or that some of the groups that seem to be stronger, it's like if they have a solid group of people that are there that are committed to doing service, and that group could say, hey, we've got Tuesday nights. We're rocking out. We're getting 30 people, 20 people. Like we've got a solid group of people that want to do service. We're getting some newcomers. What if we started a meeting on Friday night? And if that group decided to grow and have more than one meeting a week, then that group might get stronger. But that also adds a lot of workload to the group membership, where now you'd have to have enough people in that initial core that could say, hey, we're available to help get that started, and maybe we can start another meeting. But I think the idea of how we keep the unity going is, what you talked about, I think is really an important consideration. There's only so much pie. And if we keep slicing it up in all these different ways, it might actually be to the detriment of the AA community as a whole. And ultimately, what we need to be doing is supporting each other. There is no us versus them. There's only us. There's a bunch of drunks that are trying to get sober, and we're trying to learn how to organize and have these meetings. And the unity piece really is about how do we stay together? And how do we start to understand, or do we understand, that it's more important as a whole community that we support each other? And so back in the early days over here, like there's a story of in Los Angeles, whoever started the meeting, it was their name. So there was like Rusty's meeting, and there was Tex's meeting, and there was an argument one night, and so these guys went across the street and started a meeting at a church across the street at the same time because they were angry about what was going on. So now Monday night you had 2 meetings going on, and both were struggling, And one day the guys started the meeting, and someone raised their hand. They took a group conscience. They said, hey, is it possible that maybe we should just be supporting our friends, and maybe we could go across the street and support their meeting this week? And they said, fine, let's go. So they went over to the other meeting, and they had the meeting with everybody. And then the next week, the other people said, maybe we should go across the street and have the meeting with everybody again. And and they realized like it was really stupid to be splitting ourselves up and trying to, make something happen. And so I think some of that is going to happen inevitably. People are going to get resentful. People are going to want convenience. They're going to say, hey, I'm in my town. It takes me an hour to drive over there. Like if I could have a meeting here, that would be really useful. And some of that's going to be really just the natural progression of growth in an area. But if we're finding that we're doing these things and we're splitting up our community, then that would be, I think, maybe whereas as a whole, we would have to start considering like, what's the best for the community as a whole? And that's a big question that's really difficult to answer, right? Like who gets to make that call? How do we get a group conscience of all the AA people in our area? And it might be that has to be a discussion that would happen at the area or at a district level. If you have districts like we have districts here, it might be the kind of thing where we need to get together with people from every one of these groups and say like, hey, how can we help support each other? If everybody's struggling to pay their bills, then maybe we need to start figuring out how to get enough attendance at any one of these meetings so that we can actually support, the fee that our landlord has or the rent that we have to pay, and make sure that we can do this. But the fourth tradition spells out we should be good neighbors, and that would be like if I want to start a new meeting on a Tuesday night, have I consulted the other groups on a Tuesday night that might be impacted by me starting a meeting? Have I found out how they would feel if I started a meeting a mile away at the same time in a similar format? Or am I just like, screw them, I'm doing it, and I go out and do it? So what our fourth tradition would suggest is, hey, if I'm going to do something, maybe I should consult the people that would be impacted. And I find that is that's one of those that I would say that's one of the principles within the traditions that I find has some of the most application to my personal life. Am I cognizant or awake and aware of how I enter and act or how I impact the world around me? And the image that I always have is that still pond. If you've ever gotten to go to a still pond, It's just super, the water is not moving at all. It's a still day, not a lot of wind. And if you could pick up a rock and throw it into the middle of that pond, what you're going to see is the initial splash and then the waves, the ripples start going. And if it's a still body of water, you'll see that those ripples go from the middle all the way out to the end. And I think that's what this autonomy piece is asking us to consider. Am I awake and aware of how my actions in this world impact everybody around me? Now, some of that's an impossible question. I will never be able to understand how I impact the world. But I started having to think about that when I'm driving. If I drive like a maniac and I'm cutting people off, is it possible there's other people that might be scared? That I might be impacting people in negative ways that I don't think about. It was just a whole new experience. And so as an AA group, I want to start a new thing and I want to go be the big dog and, do the whole deal and be the guy in my town. Well, am I impacting the community around me in a negative way that might impact the unity of those groups, that might hurt AA groups on a broader scale? And if so, can I find a day and a time and a location that won't impact any other meeting? Or can I talk to those groups and say, hey, I was wanting to do a meeting around here Tuesday nights. I noticed you have a 7 o'clock. I wanted to find out what you guys think about that. And they might say, hey, if you start at 7:30, we got no problem with it. And you go, all right, got an answer. I'll do 7:30. So people that want 7 o'clock can be at your meeting. And if they want to wait until 7:30, they can come over here. Um, but that opens the door to, this idea of a group conscience that like, I'm not an authority in AA. And how I can find out what might impact unity is I got to talk with everybody and I got to listen to everybody. And that, I've had what I consider to be some great ideas in Alcoholics Anonymous or in my home group. And I'll bring them to the group. And the group, through the discussion of the group, what I thought was the perfect idea becomes a better idea. Because other people's perspective and other people's insight starts to slightly alter. And we actually land somewhere that was better than I could have thought up on my own. And sometimes I have an idea that I think is really great. And I hear the feedback of the group and they think it's just not necessary because we're already doing it, or it's, whatever it is. And so what this group conscience is talking about is, how do I consider what's best for everybody? Well, we bring it to everybody to have a discussion. And the story that Bill talks about is early on, the hospital that he got sober in Manhattan with Dr. Silkworth, who wrote the doctor's opinion in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It was called the Charlestown's Hospital. And he was offered a job there because he was going in and trying to help these drunks that Silkworth in the detox unit was helping, or trying to, sober up. They started letting him and some of the alcoholics in New York come to the hospital. They offered him a job. Now, Bill had no money. I mean, he was hurting. They got their house taken away, like foreclosed on. They were really struggling. And this was pre the house being taken away, but they were, so he gets on a train in Manhattan. He's coming back to Brooklyn, and it's going to be the hang at the house with some of the AA people. And he's just so excited that he's got an opportunity to get a job, get an office. He'll be able to get some money, and they'll be able to help these alcoholics now every day, and he'll be able to get paid for it. And he's going, this is it, man. And the story that he wrote in the essay was that he goes home and he starts laying this all out for the other drunks in New York. And as they listened, they started to kind of see the sidelines that maybe this wasn't a good idea. That perhaps us professionalizing treatment like that would actually be a bad idea for AA. And that was what one member said. One member basically said, Bill, we know it's really hard and you guys don't have any money, but we really feel like, at least I feel that this isn't going to be a good idea. And then everybody started to talk and they all were in agreement. And so Bill, closes the essay and he says, so spoke the group conscience. The group was right and I was wrong. The voice on the subway was not the voice of God. Here was the true voice welling up out of my friends. I listened and thank God I obeyed. And so he talks about, him having this great big idea and seeing this vision and thinking that's God's will. And then when he got with a group of people and they started having a discussion, some other points of consideration were brought to the table. And all of a sudden he was like, oh, okay, maybe that's actually what's right here and I need to obey that. Um, Go ahead, Karthik.
Yeah, this is where I get the question, Yeah, that day, the group did not let Bill go into treatment facility as a paid employee. But today, a lot of AA members are in treatment facilities, and it is okay. According to AA, it is also their job. So how did that, I feel it's a similar thing, Bill could have still been into treatment, and working as a treatment counselor or something like that and still be an AA member. Yeah, so there's a contradiction there. I just wanted to, you know, raise that up with this
Yeah.
particular story.
And I think we'll get to talk about that when we get to the eighth tradition, because that's really the one that spells out. It says we're non-professional. What does non-professional mean? And Bill classifies professionalism as the Council of Alcoholics for Fee or for Hire. But in there, what they talk about is, what we're not saying is you can't go and be a professional. And what they used to call it back in the day over here was two hatters. And it meant you're wearing two hats. As an AA member, you're a layperson. You're not a professional. You're helping drunks for fun and for free. And if you showed up in AA and or if we're here and I'm talking about this is an AA meeting, and then at some point I said, here's my personal Zelle, and it was $25 for this session. That would be me, in a sense, charging money for service. You guys I'm here talking as an AA member. I'm not talking as any kind of a professional. Like I'm just an average, a member here. And this is all for fun and for free. And so if I met somebody at a meeting and then they said, hey, would you sponsor me? And I said, yeah, for a low fee of $49.99 every phone call, I will sponsor you, and that's a great deal. You'll get an hour for $49.99, and they would be coming to me thinking they're coming to AA and now they're getting charged. So that's really like the professionalism aspect. And I think in a sense, that's what Bill was being offered, because there wasn't a treatment industry. There wasn't professionalism of this. He was going to probably have a title that might look like he was a professional when he had no qualifications to be a professional, other than he was a drunk who had just had a pretty amazing spiritual awakening. And so that could have professionalized Alcoholics Anonymous in that moment. But today, the industry of recovery and treatment has gotten to this level where it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it would be silly to say you can't go and be a clinician or work in that industry as an alcoholic who happens to be a member of a 12-step fellowship. But the reality is, when you're in that facility, you are not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous to those people. In that facility, you are the mental health clinician, you are the behavioral tech, you are the house manager. What you're doing there is a job. And your job might look like encouraging people to find sobriety, but there's a paycheck attached to it. And so if you're working as a professional, keeping that understanding that when I'm on the clock here, I am not a member of Alcoholics Anonymous talking to you. I am a treatment professional, and I'm getting paid as a treatment professional. And then when I'm off the clock, I might be an AA member, and anything we do there is for fun and for free. And so we'll talk more about that professionalism, but that is kind of that line, right? And in the beginning, this was like, they're going to give Bill Wilson an office. He hasn't gone to medical school. He hasn't done anything except be a stock speculator and a crazy, insane drunk. And now he's got sober and he's like running around telling people they got to find God. You give that guy an office and start paying him for that kind of spiritual work that we do in here for fun and for free. And that was what I believe they were kind of pushing back on as a group. So let's talk a little bit. I want to point out this idea that our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. So there's a couple of things with trusted servants. So we have 12 concepts of world service, and I see a good chunk of these concepts are really aimed at this tradition. Like this tradition underpins the entirety of how Alcoholics Anonymous does business. Um, and so here's a consideration. It kind of comes from our third concept, which is called the right of decision. But the question is, do we trust our trusted servants? If I'm at a home group and there's an election and someone stands up to say, I will do whatever commitment, do I go as the group member that has been there for a while and tell them exactly how to do it? Or do I give them a description and an overview and say, like, it's your job now, go do it? And so I think that's the big difference between trusting our trusted servants and then trying to micromanage them. Some people have taken jobs, stood and we elected them for a certain position. We said, yeah, you can be the chairperson. And then they get dreadful speakers. And everybody wants to start complaining because they're not doing a good job. But it's like, hey, we elected them. Like we gotta help support them and not second guess them and beat them over the head. And not everybody's going to be great at every job in AA, but I think part of it is this whole idea of trusting our trusted servants is to learn how to let people do the job that they stood for and let them have the experience of learning. And maybe they blow it and let maybe them blowing it and the meeting not having coffee or snacks or whatever, that they didn't show up with the key and we had to meet in the parking lot, like, let them get that experience of ruining it. Maybe that's what that job of service was for them to have that feeling and to feel like maybe embarrassed about not doing something and then realize like, oh, I got to actually do this. Um, but the idea that we don't have government here, Karthik does, seems to do quite a bit for y'all, but Karthik is just a member. I have, people in my community that have been here for a while. We have a delegate. My delegate can't come to my home group and tell us how to function. Nobody could come to this meeting that we're having here, this informal workshop, and say, you guys are doing it wrong. It's like, no, we got together and as a group, we decided this is how we want to function and this is what we're doing. Um, and so they lay out in this essay, they lay out two different types of leaders. And I'll ask you, which one do you think sounds more appealing? They call him the elder statesman and the bleeding deacon. They talk about first, I'll read the bleeding deacon. The bleeding deacon is the member who is just as surely convinced that the group cannot get along without them, who is constantly conniving for re-election to office, and who continues to be consumed with self-pity. A few hemorrhage so badly that drained of all AA spirit and principle, they get drunk. Because at times the AA landscape seems to be littered with bleeding forms. Nearly every old timer in our society has gone through this process in some degree. Happily, most of them survive and live to become elder statesmen. So the bleeding deacon is the person at the group that really thinks that without them, the group's going to fall apart, and they try to micromanage and maybe handle everything. And their ideas are always the best, and everyone needs to come on board with them. And anybody that suggests something against them is wrong. And, I've been to some groups, and you'll see there's people, I mean, even I would say people that are dear friends of mine that I've watched start groups. And I've watched them be the founder of a group, and then they really struggle when the group starts to kind of move in a different direction because different people show up and the attitude or the atmosphere of the group changes, and they kind of show up and they keep trying to, no, this is why we started the group, was supposed to be like this. But then new people have been showing up and taking service, and those people have different ideas, and the group conscience is starting to shift maybe from the initial intent. And I've seen people leave meetings they started because the group started to change a little bit and they weren't able to accept that. So the bleeding deacon sounds rough. It sounds like I'm going to be getting really upset and irritated and angry and probably crispy around the edges and yelling at people and all that stuff. And then they talk about the elder statesman. The elder statesman is the one who sees the wisdom of the group's decision, who holds no resentment over their reduced status, whose judgment, fortified by considerable experience, is sound, and who is willing to sit quietly on the sidelines, patiently awaiting developments. It goes on to say that the elder statesmen become the real and permanent leaders of AA, that theirs is the quiet opinion, the sure knowledge and humble experience that resolve a crisis. When sorely perplexed, the group inevitably turns to them for advice. They become the voice of the group conscience and, in fact, of the true voice of AA. They do not drive by mandate, they lead by example. This is the experience which has led us to the conclusion that our group conscience, well advised by its elders, will be in the long run wiser than any single leader. Now, looking at those two together, I put me in the elder statesman camp. That sounds way better than being the guy who might get drunk because he's so upset with how the group is functioning. And so to me, that's what's been difficult. I served a 4-year term at my home group on the steering committee. The last 2 years of that, I was the overall chair of the group, which meant I chaired every single business meeting and steering committee meeting, which is 2 meetings a month for 2 years straight. Into the lockdown, I had to recover a bank. I mean, it was a ton of work. And today I pass a microphone on a Monday night so that people can be heard in the meeting. I went from the chair, the guy, to now I'm setting up chairs and tearing stuff down and putting some stuff away and passing a microphone, right? And what I can tell you is that was a huge learning experience for me that was super beneficial. I've learned so much in learning how to rotate. And that's part of what I think this talks about, is that we don't have someone who stays the CEO, but people take a turn and do service and then they rotate. And rotation is so important for ourselves to learn that I'm not the most important, that my group goes on without me. But also, rotation allows for more people to get involved in service and for new ideas to come in and for new perspectives to be there. And that's helpful and healthy for every group. And so we show up and we serve. And so then it's so how do you get to a group conscience? And I think Karan just wrote the question of uninformed versus informed. Now, maybe you guys have seen this one, maybe not. But sometimes over here, what I've seen is if you're at a meeting, not necessarily a group, and there hasn't really been a discussion about who gets to vote and who is a group member and how do we conduct business. I've been in seen meetings where some guy brings 5 or 6 of his friends to a meeting and they think that it should be a different format, and they stay for a business meeting, and about 5 minutes to the end they go, "Hey, I'm here, my name's Joe, I'm alcoholic, and I think this big book meeting should become a living sober meeting, that we should be reading the book Living Sober over the big book." But he's got 5 of his friends there, and there's kind of a chairperson that maybe doesn't really know what's going on, and they go, "Well, do we have any discussion on that?" And then his friend starts, "Yeah, it's a great book, it's going to help people." And then they go, "All right, well, I guess we vote on it." And then 5 minutes before they're over, they have this new idea, gets thrown out, and then there's this dude and 5 of his friends all raise their hand, and it's that actually is a simple majority, and all of a sudden that meeting changes. To me, that's what you'd call an uninformed group conscience. It was a very hasty motion that got thrown out with no real consideration. We didn't really let members of the group who weren't present understand that there was a motion brought forward, and we'd want to have a more full discussion with everybody that might be impacted. We didn't take any time. We just threw forward an idea. Everybody said, "Okay, fine, let's do it." And we changed something. And in my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous, that's a really bad way to operate. And what we typically hear over here is that AA moves at the speed of glaciers. And there's usually nothing that needs to happen right now. Every once in a while, a group will be confronted with an issue that does have a timeline on it. The landlord just got told they have 30 days to vacate the property, so we have to find a new space. We got to figure it out quick because we got a couple of weeks and then we're done, right? So every so often, there's going to be something with the time limit on it. But generally speaking, all the items that we're talking about at a group level of change don't need to be considered and done and implemented immediately. So this is what I've been taught about how a group might get to an informed group conscience. And before I'll bring this because maybe you guys can bring it back if I forget. But the other thing is there's a difference between a business meeting and a group conscience meeting. And so I'll talk a little bit about this informed or uninformed group conscience. Then maybe I'll talk about what a group conscience meeting would be versus a business meeting. So let's say we throw out a motion. We want to change the format, or we feel like we were a speaker meeting, but we're finding it's hard to get speakers, so we want to maybe change and start alternating. So every other week is a speaker meeting, and the in between weeks are big book study or whatever, tradition, step and tradition meeting, something. That would be a format change to the group as a whole that would impact anybody who goes there, and people probably have opinions about that. And so if somebody brought that forward to a business meeting, if I was the chair, I would invite discussion on that, but I would say, based on the fact that this is a proposed change to the group as a whole, it would seem that we should at least wait a month and be announcing that we're going to continue this discussion at our next business meeting so that anybody who has an opinion can share. And if we want, we could accept written in responses, like somebody who can't be there, like I just can't be at that meeting. I got work, my family's got a thing I got to go to, but they could write in a brief, within a 2-minute kind of thing to say, here's what I think about this item, so that the group could be aware of what they think. And in that way, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get an informed group conscience, meaning we want to hear from everybody. And then what I'll mention about that too is in our concepts and in the charter for the conference that we have once a year, what we discuss is that in all matters of importance within AA, we always want to seek substantial unanimity rather than a simple majority. Now, unanimity means everybody, unanimous. It's a different way of pluralizing the word unanimous. And if you have a unanimous vote, that's everybody votes for it, nobody votes against it. And so substantial unanimity, at least how AA sees that, is basically we're looking for at least 2/3 of the people saying yes before we decide we're actually going to do something. A simple majority would mean we're 13 people in here. If we were 7-6, the 7's got it. So you're in the 6, you're out of here. You lose. There's a group in New York City that is historically was the largest group on the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. On a Tuesday night, you would get almost 600 people into this church. I mean, it was wild. The beginning of this year, there was a business meeting and a steering committee meeting, and it was brought forward a discussion about a group member and some behavior that they thought was wrong. And there was this whole thing about they might have to kick this person out of the group. And the vote came down 11-10. That's about as close of a simple majority as you can get. And they decided to ask this person to not go. They adhered to the simple majority because they felt they had to do it. Well, that group is completely split in half now. The people that were in the minority that thought this was terrible, they have gone and started another meeting about 40 blocks south or 30 streets south at the same time on Tuesday nights at 7:00. And half of the membership of that group is now going to a meeting downtown instead of in Midtown. And to me, it's a pretty telling example of what happens when you have a simple majority versus substantial unanimity. And it's not necessarily about uninformed or informed group conscience, but if I'm going to really look at, we need consensus here. Why? Because the unity of our group is the most important thing. And if we're like split down the middle, that shows that we don't really have unity. And so in any given vote at a group level, you have a yes and a no, or you abstain. And the actions you could take are we're going to do it, we're not going to do it, or we don't really have substantial unanimity, therefore we should probably take no action because we clearly have a division within our group and we don't have an answer that satisfies everybody. And taking no action on an item is taking action. And so those kind of, to me, are the three ways that a group conscience will go. Either there's clearly we all are in favor of something and we're going to do it, or we're not in favor of it, we don't do it, or we're so split in the middle that we don't have something to do, and so maybe we just don't change. Um, and the last thing I'll mention about this is another part from our concepts is in any given vote, and in my opinion, any way for us to get an informed group conscience has to include a minority opinion. Which means that if you were in the side that was maybe it's 30-1. I've been the one in my home group. It was 30 people voted for something. I was the one that voted against it. And I've had times where I shared why I voted against something and the group said, we don't care. And we did it anyways, and that's fine. But I also have had one experience where I was the one person that voted no. And when I shared why I voted no, everybody went, oh yeah, he's kind of right on that. And then we retooled what we were doing and we came to a different thing. And so ultimately this whole thing about group conscience is we need to make sure everybody gets heard. Because if I feel like I got run over in a business meeting and you guys didn't listen to me or hear me out, I might not come back. I might grow resentment on that. Maybe I'm not working a real program. Like that could be something that would mean, I could struggle with. It could impact the unity of our group as a whole. But if we listen to everybody, we make sure everybody gets heard, we get prayerful. That's the other thing. I think before voting, this is my own thing. It doesn't necessarily happen in my home group, but I've seen it in other bodies that I've done service in. They'll take a minute or two quiet after everything has been shared, and they'll say, okay, before we go to a vote, we're going to take 90 seconds or 2 minutes quiet here to get prayerful and ask God for some intuition. And then let's all vote our conscience. I think, this whole thing about God is coming through in the group conscience involves, am I bringing God into the conversation? Am I bringing God into my heart and listening to everybody? And am I willing to concede that if my idea doesn't get accepted, am I willing to accept that if the group conscience goes against my idea, that's God showing up saying my idea is not maybe bad, but it's not the thing to do right for this group of people? The worst thing I could do is to not accept the group conscience and push back and become a thorn in everybody's side at the meeting. I'm going to stop and we'll go to questions all around in just one second. The last thing I'll say on that specifically is like in my area, like US and Canada recently, we've been having some kind of larger changes that people have had a lot of opinions about. We changed how we read our preamble of Alcoholics Anonymous. We took out the genderization of men and women, and now the preamble reads Alcoholics Anonymous as a fellowship of people. And there's been some other big things that people have had a lot of issue with it. But with that one specifically, what I can tell you is I travel a decent bit, and I get to go all over the country. And sad to say, from my perspective, is I've been to a lot of groups that basically say, I don't really care that you change the preamble fundamentally, that is, if I looked up AA.org, the preamble, I would find Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women. But there's a bunch of people that just say that's a load of crap. And they read the preamble as it was before it was changed. And from my perspective, that could look like making a decision to completely ignore the second tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous because as a group, I don't agree with it. And I think that's maybe the more concerning piece for me, is that am I willing to go along with things that I don't necessarily agree with personally because I'm willing to put the unity of Alcoholics Anonymous first? I'm willing to say that if this is a group conscience of AA as a whole, that must be God showing up. And my job is to go along with that because I'm not God. And my job is to figure out how to be in unity with all of you. And my personal beliefs don't have to play into any of this. But if I really am going to hitch my wagon to Alcoholics Anonymous and really embrace these traditions, then at any group level, if there's if there's a consideration period, we all get prayerful, we talk with some people, and we come to a vote, and it goes against what I think. Am I willing to give up what I think is right in order to stay in unity with all of you? Am I willing to not show up every week and complain about the change that just happened that I didn't want to have happen? That kind of looks like a bleeding deacon to me. Or am I willing to say, you know what, I'm not God, let's sit back and watch? Because the thing about AA, and I'll close with this, the thing about AA, someone said, they go, every decision we make isn't the final one. You can always go and make another decision. 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, if some change happened to your group and it's clearly a bad idea and it's not going well, you guys will bring that back up and we'll change it back. So sometimes it's about, we got to sit in and just watch what happens, and be willing to accept that I'm not always the one with the right answer. And so I think that's part of what I'm asked to give up here in this group conscience. I'm asked to consider that the group voting together, if it's informed, if it's a last minute hasty thing, then that's maybe different. But I think we give it some space, bring God into the picture, open our hearts, listen to everybody, listen to the people that disagree with us. Try to really find out, do they have something that's useful here? And am I missing something? And then we vote our conscience based on the intuition we believe in our heart that God has given us. And however that vote goes, if there is a change that I don't like, my job is to be on board and support the unity of my group, because that trumps what I think needs to happen. So that's really what I think the second tradition is about. And in practice, it's making sure everybody has a voice, making sure everybody's heard. And I think in principle, then it's like learning how to try to be more of the quiet presence in the group once you get some experience, to let the group discuss and sit in the back and listen before I open my mouth, because I have a lot to say, as you can see. Anyways, let's go to questions. I think you're up, Karth.
Okay. So the couple of questions, but I'll give time to others. I'll ask just one. I have actually two more. The first question is, there's here, at least in this fellowship I am, there is this conception that, we need to take fast decisions because alcoholics are dying out there, you know. As we delay the death rate. But, again, as the second tradition and the experience shows, the A moves at a glacier speed, as you said, you know, for an iceberg speed. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts? Probably there's 2 points here. One, something might impact alcoholics outside, but we should not take hasty decisions. Usually we give a lot of time. Uh, Even my previous sponsor told me the same thing, things in AA move very slowly. So that should be the right pace because God doesn't move hastily. So yeah, but there's this other conception. We need to take things fast. Yeah, we are going too slow. Uh, I faced the same thing when I was a PI chair. Everybody wanted to move very fast. I told them, no, it has to go through the process. So yeah, go ahead. That's my question, and we'll take others before I come back to my second and third question.
Yeah. So I guess what I have maybe a couple of thoughts. One is, I'm also interested in like what kind of thing people are suggesting is we're not doing, so people are dying. I think if we're getting involved in the spirit of service and we're helping to try to get AA's message out there or some stuff, then we can go do that. But we should also be deliberate and try to utilize the experience of others, especially if it's like PI stuff or CPC things. It's like, there's clearly like resources we can use, but I don't want to ever pour water on someone's fire to go and try to find alcoholics and help them. Where I think it's more about moving slower is like, do we really need to change the meeting format all the time? Or do we need to change our literature all the time? Do we need to constantly tinker with things? And I think there's a natural, it seems like, human desire to want to tinker with stuff and try to make things better, or we could do it better this way. And I've got an idea on what should happen. And I think the moving slow part is also more on the like, is it possible that AA can well was working fine without me and would continue to work fine whether I was here or not. And maybe I should have some humility to just try to learn how this thing has been functioning before I come in and try to change it. And so that might be part of it, is if I think I've got all these ideas of what needs to happen, it's not about don't be excited, but it's also like, let's use the experience of what people have done before us. And perhaps it's working well. So what I should learn is learn how this is all functioning and learn how to be a member here. And then if I have some experience that might be valid, I can bring that forward and maybe some change would happen. Like I proposed an agenda item this year about how our board functions, or a really in the weeds idea for our general service board. And at 14 years of sobriety, after a lot of experience with below the group level service and having friends that are past trustees and getting to see how this stuff works, I was like, I think I have an idea that might be useful. Now, my area subsequently decided to kick my teeth in when I brought it to them, and did not seem to really care, or I don't know. It was a very weird experience. I had to write some inventory about a month ago. So that was good. And but I still submitted it anyways. And it's like I can submit as a member to the board. Here's my proposed agenda item. But it took me a lot of time and a lot of thought. I thought about that item for 2.5 years before I put words to it and tried to put it in. So I think, some of it, it's like, does it need to happen right this second? But if it's like, hey, man, there's a facility that wants to get a meeting going, like, why not get some people now and start taking a meeting in to try to find some alcoholics? Like, I think those are the things where it's like, if it's 12-step service, go for it. But if we're trying to organize something larger and do it really fast, like maybe we could slow down and find out how other people have organized something that's a larger piece of it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, if we have a framework going, maybe let's understand that framework first before changing it. But by no means should we use that as a hindrance to not try to go and help alcoholics that are still suffering. I think the lens of sponsorship and recovery is maybe not under that umbrella, where you might only have a couple hours with the guy, and that couple of hours might be the moment in his life or in her life where she is open to some grace. And if we don't get in there and actually offer somebody a real solution and give them some hope, they might never come back. And so there are those moments where it is really crucial that, like, if you're dying of alcoholism, I think it's my job to help you right now. And to make myself available to that as best I can. But at a group level, we don't need to change things every single week, or at an area level. But it feels like we'll get some more, so we'll get back to you. But go ahead, Karan.
Yeah. So I guess like I have two questions that just like go fold into each other. One is how frequently do we need to take group conference, and how deep do we need to get with the questioning, right? Because I can say I'll start a format of a meeting. It can go as deep as, what's the format, what's the timing, who are like, is it a closed or an open, like that. We can just go into finer and finer details. Sometimes they would be wasting a lot of time doing that. And the other time is, how do we translate that into outside an AA group? I mean, if I'm traveling with an AA group, do I need to take group conference for everything that I'm going to do? If I'm traveling with them, do I need to take a group conference on where we are going to eat? I mean, at what time they're going to start, you know? And in a place where it's out of AA, how do we, where the traditional group conference approach, which we are not aware of, the people who are non-alcoholics, how do we practice that there?
See, I knew you guys would point out the things that I forgot to talk about, which is how this would apply outwards. So a couple of things. One, on the group level, usually when a group is organized, like when Karthik and I were talking about, let's do this, like we were able to basically put down, here's what we think is going to happen. Now we got together last week and people were like, hey, we should open it up and just allow anybody to show up. And that was like us having a little discussion and coming to realize that everybody here kind of felt like, why limit it? Let's let people come in. So that was a quick opportunity for us to just have a discussion with everybody here and find out how people feel about something. Um, I think if you're doing like a group trip, probably somebody got hired or elected to chair that thing or run it. And so to me, if I got put in a position to plan things out, I might have a committee of some other people. But ultimately, if I was given the service commitment to plan out a trip, then I'm given that authority or I'm given that responsibility to do that. And I think the other side of that would be I'd be given the right of decision to make decisions about what we're going to do. And if people don't like what we're going to do, then they can stand up and they can be the chair next year and they can put it together in their way. So there is that balance between like, it's about trust and trusted servants. If I was given the responsibility to help put all this stuff together, then asking every single person who's involved their feedback for every detail is probably going to mean I'm never going to get anything accomplished. And so there is that part, like where the committee and getting everybody's feedback is important. But if I was elected the chair, I'm also given the right of decision here to make decisions. And that is part of how we start to see the role in general service with the concepts, and a delegate going to the general service conference gets to vote their conscience. They've listened to their area and their area has given them some insight of how they feel about certain issues within AA, but then that delegate has every right to vote how they feel in the conference. And then they just have to come back and tell the area what they did. And if the area goes, we really don't agree with you, they can get a new delegate. But so in reality, it's like, how does this work? Is a great question. And to me, I start looking at, well, am I basically telling people what's going to happen for everything and just always being the one making the decisions and saying, here's what we're doing? Or if we have a couple of people, like if I'm at a family, with my wife, if we have a day off or we have some time off, it's usually more like, hey, what were you hoping to get done this weekend? And do you have any ideas of what you would like to do? Because we look like we have some time together and wanted to figure out how we could enjoy spending some time together. Versus me being like, I got us tickets to go see this thing, and here's what we're doing on Saturday, and here's what Sunday is, and and it's like, to me, that's the difference between I'm telling somebody here's what we're doing, or I'm going to my partner and I'm asking, hey, did you have any aspirations of what you wanted to do? I think at work, it could be the same way. If you're a part of a team and you've got an idea, it's like, am I willing to bring my idea to the team and say, hey, here's what I was thinking about doing. Does anybody, do you guys feel this is sensible? If I'm the team leader and I'm in charge of managing people, then there's a moment where, again, I have to make calls and say, here's what we need to have happen. If you have feedback or think this could be done better, please let me know and I'll take it into consideration. And trying to create that, like, where it's not a wall between me and other people. One of my heroes would talk about doing group conscience with his family. And he said, him and his wife, there was like three kids and him and his wife. And he goes, my wife and I each had our vote counted for 2 votes. So there was the 3 kids, but then we actually had 4 votes. So we could always kind of block something crazy that the kids wanted. Like, what do you want for breakfast? And they'd say pizza. Okay, we're not doing pizza. We can block, but the idea was, are we willing to get involved with inviting everybody to the table? My buddy Jason has a great story where he's got 2 daughters and, his wife, and he had an opportunity to get involved in like a startup company. And it was this like a newer company doing like kind of the dream job, like something he'd always wanted to do, but it was a new company and a startup. And so it's taken a risk. And he talked about sitting down with his wife and his 2 daughters and laying it out for everybody. What do you guys think? I've been given this opportunity for this job. Here's financially what it's going to look like. And, what do you guys think of, here's what my schedule would look like. Here's financially what it would look like. What are your thoughts on this? And then his daughters were able to ask questions. And one of the questions one of his daughters asked him was, you know, if it's a startup, it has a higher likelihood that it maybe would fail, and this would be something that would only last a little bit, and then you'd be like out of a job. And he was like, yeah, that's very true. And they had this whole discussion as a family, and they looked at what were the potential liabilities and what was maybe difficult, and also the potential benefits of it. And everybody in the family, after a while, they all said, yeah, go for it. It sounds like it's the opportunity for you, and go for it. And to me, that's one of those great examples of, involving the family as a whole before we just blanket make decisions, again, that would impact potentially the family as a whole. And I think that's one of those, it could be as simple as, where do you want to get dinner tonight? Or as complicated as, I'm changing careers and this is what it could be. But I think the ultimate understanding here is for us to make sure that we have unity within our family, that we don't unilaterally become the boss of the family. If I'm working amongst peers and we're all kind of on that same level, that I don't try to stand up and become the person who's always running it, but I actually take time to get everybody included in decisions that would impact everybody in the team, and make sure that we're on the same page, and try to get their feedback as well, and make sure that people feel like they're a part of. I think that's the biggest thing with group conscience, and understanding that it's about making sure everyone feels like they're a part of. And if I just tell you what's going to happen, it's my way or the highway. I mean, I guess if I own my own business, I could do that, right? If you're a small business owner and you want to run it that way, you could do it. But you might end up with a lot of morale issues and a lot of turnover. But if you want to maybe, dig into, let me see what everybody thinks, and maybe everybody together collectively can make a better, has better ideas than me by myself. And I think that's kind of been the underpinning with a lot of this. So, we can bring that to our families, weekend plans, taking a vacation. Where would you want to take a vacation? What would you like to have happen? These are questions I have with my partner. Do you have any ambitions for this vacation? What do you really want to do for these days? And find out what my wife wants to do before I just start making a bunch of plans. Try to ask her what she thinks. Would it be okay if I stayed up while you go to bed because I'm kind of awake? And, she wants me to come in and fall asleep with her, and there's days where I'm just wide awake. So trying to find some compromises in there, and just have that line of communication open, I think has been a much more fruitful way to build a relationship. Um, so I hope that answers some of that question. I feel like I can't remember the first part of it though. What was the first part of that?
Yeah, like I guess you answered that. Going to the nitty-gritties in terms of planning, and not doing it
Oh,
takes
yeah.
obviously time,
So,
right? Yeah.
so what I'll say on that, right? Like, there's a couple of things. If you're starting the meeting, you can get as granular as you want. And again, it's like every group can run it how it wants to be run. But then what we'll do over here is something called a group inventory. And this would be more akin to what a group conscience, I mentioned, like group conscience versus a business meeting. Group conscience meeting would not be about taking any action, but maybe there's something that's been happening at the group, and it would be useful for the group to get together outside of the regular meeting time, stay after for a moment and have a discussion and reflect on, maybe there's a bunch of drug addicts that are showing up to the meeting. Maybe a new treatment center is bringing a bunch of people and they're all addicts. And you're like, this is a closed meeting. What do we do about the fact that there's all these addicts showing up? And maybe we need to get a group conscience before we make a decision. We need to get together and have that discussion as a group to find out what we think. And then maybe that becomes an actionable item to bring to a business meeting. But the idea of a group conscience meeting usually is an opportunity for the group members to get together and have an open discussion about something. And that can be about anything that you might feel is impacting the unity of the group. In that example, I've seen groups go from being a closed meeting to an open meeting because they had a treatment bus that brought a bunch of drug addicts to them. They said, if this is where they can go, we don't want to take that away from them. If we make it an open meeting, they're allowed to come without violating any traditions. And then we'll just make it really clear that if you don't have a problem with alcohol and you're a drug addict, you're welcome to attend the meeting and talk to us afterwards. But we invite you not to share during the meeting. But, and then we'll get you some resources on a fellowship that might more work for what you have. And then the group inventory would be the opportunity to sit down as a group and really take a look at these traditions and have somebody facilitate us as a group getting together and talking about how we think we're doing and where we might be able to improve, just like we take inventory in fourth step or on our 10th and 11th step that a group could take a group inventory to go, how are we doing? And a lot of times, at least out here, they run those kind of looking through the 12 traditions and going, do we feel like there's unity in our group? Do we feel that there's group conscience? Do we have elder statesmen or bleeding deacons? What do we have membership requirements? And just starting to walk through how are we adhering to the primary purpose, or what is this group's primary purpose? Do we feel like we're adhering to that? And basically give an opportunity for the group to have a couple hours to sit down and discuss potential things that we see are going well or not going well that could then open the door for the next couple of business meetings to comb through that, and maybe there is some actionable items that we come to. And so that's maybe like a larger way to start understanding how the group's doing, if there's a need for some things, or people feel there's issues they just haven't brought forward. So those are ways that on a larger scale you could get really in depth, or you could also just say, screw it. I mean, it's working. So, until my friends started a meeting and they're like, we're not doing a business meeting. This is what it is. We get together, we read a paragraph of the big book, we all share on it until everyone's done. We read another, like, that's it. We don't need a business meeting for that. And they're like, no. And they have every right to do that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted you to illustrate the difference between a group conference meeting and a business meeting. From what I understood from what you said, is the group needs to have open discussions about certain actionable items they want to discuss. And once they take a group conscience on that, then it flows into a business meeting actionable items that they have to take a group conscience on.
So yeah, I only brought up the distinction because I feel like a lot of times in a business meeting is where you'll have this open discussion. There might not be a lot going on, and someone might just bring forward, hey, we have this thing that's been happening. We got this guy who smells really bad, is unhoused, and is disruptive. What do we want to do something about that guy, or whatever it is. And you might be able to just start having that discussion right there. And it may turn into emotion. And my whole thing was, if we're turning into emotion, maybe we need to take a break and make sure everybody's on board, not just make a decision immediately and after that discussion, but let's take a moment, we'll revisit this, and we'll vote next month after we've been able to consider this and make sure everybody who might be involved in the group can come in and participate. But there may be items that show up where it's like, outside of the regular group business, which a lot of times a group business meeting is going to involve the reports from the literature chair and the treasury and all the other reports of what is there, a GSR report? Is there an intergroup delegate report? So a lot of the business meeting is going to get eaten up just by the reports of the group and finding out how we're doing. And it's going to be ideally usually more focused on just making sure the group is functioning. But if there's some bigger thing that shows up that we feel like we need to have a discussion about, you could look as a group to have a group conscience meeting, which would be maybe a half hour or an hour that you set aside just to talk about something that people think is important. It's not going to become a motion. We're not going to vote in the group conscience meeting, but it would be an opportunity to have a discussion about something to find out if we need to maybe address something that seems to be happening. And so those would be, the business meeting would be then when you're going to start making a motion to, can we have a vote and change something? But perhaps there's more of a discussion that needs to happen, or something needs to, we need to discuss what we want to do with XYZ problem. And maybe we'll do that in a separate meeting. But in practice, a lot of times that in my home group, that's the stuff that comes up during a business meeting. And then we'll have a discussion, and that discussion might last for a month or two into the next meeting. It'll become old business, and we'll bring back that discussion and we'll talk about it in old business. And if it was going to be a potential vote during the month in between every meeting we're going to have, or say, hey, there's going to be another part, we're going to be continuing the discussion on disruption and safety in the meeting. If you'd like to have a vote on that kind of an issue, or have your voice heard, we're going to be continuing that discussion and possibly making a vote on an actionable item this coming meeting. And so sometimes they blur together. But for my money, I think that the group conscience meetings, when we know there doesn't have to be a vote or a motion, it's just an opportunity for us to get involved in a discussion about something and really hear from everybody. I think that could be maybe more beneficial than the idea that people think, oh, I got to make a motion now so we can vote. But it's like, why don't we just get together and talk about this? And maybe out of that, out of hearing everybody, we'll come into the next business meeting and say, hey, I've got an idea of what I want to do. So I hope that makes some sense. And I would say, again, it
Okay.
falls to every group could do it how you want to do it. So if you guys do that kind of discussion in a general business meeting, fine. If you want to hold a separate meeting, that's all good too. And it might be you try some stuff out and see what works.
Okay. So I think we are close to time here. Actually, we are out of time.
Did you have another
So
question though before we call it?
yeah, I just wanted to know if anybody else has a question. We can also continue next week. So anybody else that has a question? Okay, seems like nobody has a question. So my question was, should we continue next week, Devin? We are already like 4 minutes into the clock. Like,
Wait, say that again. The question is, do we continue?
yeah, should we continue with my question next week, or should I just ask it?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, if you want to ask it now, that's fine.
Okay. So let me ask this question. So when you say informed group conscience, so who informs the group? Is it the chair? And is the information about how this motion will impact our traditions or what the chair is thinking about it? Does it also include the practicality of that motion?
That's a great question. I guess, and I don't know if I didn't say this again, but like I'm not an authority on any of this. I'm just a member. So when I'm thinking informed versus uninformed, what I'm thinking more of is, have we heard from everybody? That like the uninformed group conscience would be only hearing from like 4 or 5 people of the group and then making a decision. But if the group is 20 people strong, I want to be informed of the other 15 people's insight on this before I vote. That it would less be, I mean, obviously, hopefully in the discussion, we're getting to really hash out what the item is about and the information behind it. But I think ultimately, when I'm thinking of informed versus uninformed, is everybody in the group informed of what we're doing? And has everybody in the group been able to share what they think so that we can actually hear from everybody? So that before I vote, I am informed on how the group as a whole seems to feel. That I've heard the people that are for it, and I've heard the people that are against it, and that I'm going to get quiet and I'm going to vote with my conscience based on being informed about what everybody thinks. And people are going to disagree with me all the time, is what I've learned. Or people aren't going to understand what I might have to say, and that's fine. But my job is to listen to everybody else so that if I'm going to cast a vote, I'm going to cast a vote considering how everybody else in my home group feels and what they think. Then I can consider what's best for the unity of my group as a whole. So even if I'm for something and I think it's a great idea, if most of the group is against it, I mean, I'll still vote for it because I believe in it. And if they ask for a minority opinion, I'll still say, here's what I'm against. But then when the vote happens and it's against me, my job would be to accept that that is the group conscience and that is God showing up in my home group, so that I'm not going to fight that. But I would say informed versus uninformed. Hopefully during the discussion, we've made it clear what it is we're discussing and the merits of it, or the people's, not into it stuff. But it's more about making sure everybody's heard. And so for my money, if we're starting a discussion one business meeting and it's like a pretty large item that might impact how the group functions, or the day that we were going to move from Monday night to Tuesday night, like that's impacting everybody that's looking for a Monday night meeting. So let's make sure we hear from everybody before we make that decision. If we don't hear from everybody, we're making an uninformed decision without considering how it would impact everybody in the group. So that's, I think, more what I think about as informed and uninformed is everybody who's a part of this group getting a voice and getting heard. And if we haven't given them that space, is it possible that we're making an uninformed decision and we don't actually understand how this would impact the unity of the group as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So let's end it here. Probably, are we going to continue with tradition two next week, or are we? Because I have a couple more questions. Yeah, we can explore it into next week, of course.
I'm totally fine with that. I mean, and as we're starting to see, like some of the questions are hinting on other traditions, right? So it's all gonna, again, it all kind of flows together. So if there's other things that we want to start with, we can recap and start with some questions and then keep it rolling. You know, that's fine
Okay.
with me.
So let's end the recording, I guess.